Jonathan Daniel Wells. You are a social, cultural, and intellectual historian is interested in the literary, cultural, and political evolution of the 19th century America. You have written and edited 10 books already, and your latest book is The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street, Slavery, and the Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So, Jonathan, this book gives us an understanding about more or less how our economy in the United States evolved. And, it just grew on the backs of Black slaves, and which is an unfortunate event. Many people try to put that a little detailed history down, make it disappear. And then there is persistent people like you who wants to bring it up. I guess it's better to be informed than to be ignorant. And I appreciate your perspective. Can we start by you telling us a little bit about you? I mean, you have devoted part of your life to studying 19th century America. So you have ignored, for the most part, the other aspects of history and humanity, and you just had focus on this and on this segment of time. And I wonder what is it that interests you, or how do you get into this field?
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, the 19th century is interesting because it's got so many different things going on. Of course, that's true of every time period, right? But to me, the 19th century represents a series of really important crossroads where the United States, politically and in terms of its economy, embarks on chosen paths. For example, this is the time when the United States is moving from an agrarian economy to an increasingly industrialized economy, one that's based on capitalism. And I think it's important to remember, as hard as it is to remember, that that's a result of conscious choices made by groups and individuals. It didn't just happen, without direct human involvement. So you've got the movement to capitalism and industrialization. You have the movement of people to cities. You've got the real opening up of American politics in this period. We're still, unfortunately, as a country, excluding women and people of color, particularly people of African descent. But it is a period in which the vote and the participation in the electoral process is opening up for poor white men for the first time. So that's not insignificant. We have a national sort of political culture that develops. So there's just so much going on. You have great literature in this period, right? You've got Melville and Hawthorne and Dickinson. You've got tremendous Black intellectuals like Frederick Douglass. So, yeah, for me, it's just a period that, even though it's a pretty well-studied era in American history, it just continues to hold fascination.
Okay, so in retrospect, it makes sense why you choose this field. But when you were 17 years old and you had all these options available to you, what is it at that time that, the little angel on your shoulder say, maybe we should go this way? What was going on in your head at that time?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not so much a little angel on my shoulder as it was my own father, who was retired now, but he was an American literature professor. So he was one who studied the pre-Civil War American literature. He specialized in, the authors I just mentioned, what used to be called the American Renaissance, Emily Dickinson and Nathaniel Hawthorne and all the great authors of that period. So I grew up knowing a bit about what 19th century America was interested in, what kind of society it was. But it really began to come into focus to me when I went to college. And I wanted to study the history of the American South. I'm from North Carolina. So I was really interested in the history of that region. And so a lot of my work early on in my career was about Southern history. And in the last 5 or 10 years, I've been much more interested in the history of Black people and the Black experience in the country. And the last couple of books, I've really tried to focus on that. So if anybody's to get the credit or the blame, I suppose it's my father for having inculcated the interesting aspects of 19th century American history early on in my life.
Okay, and you mentioned you have written a few books. Can you tell us a little bit about your development as a writer and some of the books that you have already written?
So my first book was called The Origins of the Southern Middle Class, and it was about the pre-Civil War period, and it was about the way in which we had assumed for a long time, we meaning, you know, the public or those who are interested in history as well as academic scholars, they had assumed that in the American South before the Civil War, you basically had two classes in society. You had the upper class, the planters, the white planters, the plantation owners, the wealthy, the elite. And then you had, of course, nearly 4 million enslaved people. And so there were little attention devoted to the vast majority of white people who really didn't even own a single slave because they couldn't afford it. Not because they were anti-slavery or because they thought there was anything wrong with slavery, or certainly not because they were interested in racial equality, but because they simply didn't have the means to afford to purchase an enslaved person. So that really was what that book was directed toward, and what that had to do with the region as it developed politically and the coming of the Civil War. And then I did some other work on women, both Black and white women, who edited their own newspapers and magazines in the 19th century, women who we would probably refer to today as journalists. And again, trying to upend a little bit our assumptions about the American South in the 19th century. That, for example, the Southern belle, right? The white Southern woman from the planter class who was educated and wealthy and member of the elite, basically playing the piano and reading all day. When in fact, many of them were interested in starting their own newspapers, which they edited. They wrote for magazines. And then later on in that century, after the Civil War, we see a large number of Black Southern women doing the same thing and even forming female Black press associations. So it was really about the 19th century women who edited their own newspapers and magazines. So after a while, I became interested in the history of the American North. And I found that I really didn't know as much about people, particularly Black people's experience in places like New York City and Boston and Philadelphia in the 19th century. So I had to do a lot of catching up. I had to do a lot of reading and sort of seeing where other people had worked. And that really led me to this issue of the fugitive slave law, the fugitive slave crisis that I've written about in the last two books.
Okay, so I have a question in regards to slavery. Of course, I'm from a South American country. I live in Canada, and my knowledge is limited. So at one time in history, a group of white people decided it would be a great idea to bring slaves from Africa to work on the plantations. Now, to what extent that was legalized to the whole country, or was it something that was nascent, state by state? And then there is the division of free states and slave states, for lack of other term. What created that division? Why some states were free states and why were not? And there was a law, I forgot what's the law that was there. Anyway, so there was this law, the slavery, whatever. Yes. So yeah. Why is it that the people in the North decided, okay, we're going to make this illegal? And then, of course, the Southern states had this financial interest to keep it going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really long and tortured history of the country, but it's one that Americans really need to know and know well. So a good place to start for your listeners would be the New York Times 1619 project. And you can easily Google that and find out more information. But the endeavor was a reference to the fact that as early as 1619, we knew that there were Black people brought from Africa to serve as slaves in colonial Virginia. And by the time we get to the 1700s, slavery has indeed spread to all of the states along the Atlantic coast, all the way from Massachusetts to down to Georgia. And over time, the states in the north, and I'm talking about, north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the states like New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, they were less beholden to slavery. The soil in those states was never really conducive to growing the kinds of crops that are going to be successfully grown in the South, particularly cotton. And so by the time we get to the late 1700s, the states in the North, well, at this point, of course, they're still colonies, they have mostly done away with slavery or have begun to do away with slavery. So when the time the Constitutional Convention meets in Philadelphia in 1787, we've already got this division going on in the colonies between the northern colonies that have done away mostly with servitude. They were never really invested heavily in it to begin with, and it's sort of easy for them to ratchet it down to almost zero. Whereas in the southern colonies, particularly thanks to what will be the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, cotton becomes so important to every one of the southern soon-to-be states. So that's how we get this division. And the problem, from the perspective of hindsight, is that at the Constitutional Convention, the so-called founding fathers, those who are drafting the Constitution and making these compromises between freedom and slavery, have a really difficult task at hand. And if your listeners are interested in this topic, I would direct them to a book by David Wallstreicher, a historian, who's written a book called Slavery's Constitution. And he makes the case that at the Constitutional Convention, there were a number of obfuscations and compromises made over slavery. One of them, for our purposes, is really important for right now, and that is the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. Yeah. So that, just in brief, said if you were a Black person, an enslaved person, who somehow made it to freedom, right? Somehow made it from a slave state like Virginia or Georgia or the Carolinas, and either by stowing away on a ship or stowing away on a railroad or crossing over land at night, the borders are really porous, right? I mean, it's not like there's a gate at the border saying, okay, now you're entering, the state of Pennsylvania, and now it's a free state. So there's a lot of a potential ability to go back and forth across these imaginary borders between slavery and freedom. So if, against all odds, you somehow make it to freedom in a state like Pennsylvania or New York or Massachusetts, the Constitution said that did not mean you were free. In fact, it obligates those free states to return you to bondage in the South. And that's one of those compromises that probably, without which the Constitution itself may never have come to fruition, and we might not have a union. But it's one of the ticking time bombs that sort of, laid in the middle of what Lincoln would later call the House divided. Wow. And, that sort of sets the stage. And that's why I think in some ways, the Civil War is inevitable. Because all of these things are set in motion at the nation's founding, and it's just a matter of time before they'll collapse and cause civil war.
And that's where the Kidnapping Club is born, where there is this group of individuals who are taking slaves and sending them back, and even free-born Blacks, Native American, who were born free already, they are also being kidnapped and sent back. So can you tell us more about this whole tragedy?
Yeah, tragedy is indeed the right word. So the fact that Northern police officers and judges are given authority to arrest people they suspect of being runaways is really what lays the foundation for this group called the Kidnapping Club. And it wasn't really a social organization, although all the people involved knew each other. But it's kind of this loose conglomeration of police officers, particularly a couple of guys named Tobias Boudinot and Daniel Nash, and some judges, including Richard Riker, who is the city recorder, who sits over a lot of these, presides over a lot of these cases of accused runaways. And it's also some lawyers and other people involved that really make life precarious for Black people in the city of New York for most of the early part of the 19th century. And what they would do in this case, for example, Tobias Boudinot, a police officer, who's, for lack of a better word, really the villain of this story, he roams the city streets of Manhattan. He goes to Brooklyn. He goes around surrounding communities in search of runaways. And he really doesn't care whether somebody's been born free and had been born, into freedom in New York City long before, or whether these people are in fact, runaways from enslavement. And he goes about arresting them. And he says, oh, I know you. You're Joe Smith, who ran away from Virginia, 3 years ago. I'm taking you before the city recorder, Richard Riker. And Riker himself is very disposed to deciding people are runaways. And there's very little evidence presented. For most of this period, there's no jury trial. And in a matter of hours, somebody can be taken off the streets of New York City, brought before the city recorder, Richard Riker, and taken into Southern bondage before really the family members even know he or she is gone. So it's a nefarious system, and it operates with impunity because the political and legal system is really geared toward acquiescing to Southern slavery. And the reason why Wall Street is in the subtitle of the book is because New York, in many ways, is making its wealth and its power because of the cotton trade. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but basically, the reason why New York Wall Street financiers are becoming rich and powerful, the reason bankers are making so much money is because they're facilitating the movement of Black-grown and harvested cotton in the South to the textile mills, where they'll be turned into fine linens and curtains and clothing. And all that is facilitated by New York merchants and bankers and financiers. So the bottom line is New York has a vested interest in making sure that the constitutional compromise over slavery is kept completely intact.
Right, and I can see that direct link in the upper echelons of finance and money. But for this police officer, for this judge, what was the direct financial compensation for the things that they were doing?
Yeah, that's a great point. For one, they would reap the reward for returning a runaway. So if you go into almost any newspaper in America, particularly in places like New York City, but also all across the country, you will see advertisements in the newspaper. And the advertisements say, my slave woman, Lucy, ran away from my plantation in March of 1832. For anybody who finds her, I will give them a $25 reward or a $50 reward. So that's one key way that they reap financial benefit. There is actually a couple of instances when Boudinot himself actually facilitates the purchase of the freedom of somebody. So in other words, a Southern slave owner decides, it's not worth it to go through all the trouble. If you just give me $100 or, if you can raise $100 and give it to me, then I'll forget all this and let that person free. And so Boudinot serves as kind of a broker in these transactions. I mean, for crying out loud, this is a police officer in New York City. operating as a slave broker. But there's another key reason why all this is transpiring, and part of it has to do with money, the reward money that Boudinot and others can get. But it also has to do with where the Democratic Party is at this point in American history. So many of your listeners will know that the Democratic and Republican Party of the 1850s is much different from the way they are now. It's 180 degrees different. In this period of American history, the Democrats are the reactionary. They're the conservatives. So if Donald Trump had been alive in the 1850s, he would have been a Democrat in New York City. And they are absolutely, of course, they're fundamentally racist, but they're also fundamentally of the belief that in order to keep the Union together, right, and to keep the prosperity that New York City is enjoying continuing, they have to abide by the constitutional compromise over slavery, right? Because what if all of a sudden New Yorkers said, oh, we don't believe in the fugitive slave law or the clause, so we're not going to abide by it anymore. Well, then this endangers the entire country, the constitutional government under which all of this prosperity is taking place. So Riker's a Democrat. Many of the guys in Tammany Hall, which is sort of the center point of power in New York City in the Democratic Party, their racism dovetails quite nicely with their belief that we have to return runaways or else we'll anger the South and we'll jeopardize the Union itself.
Wow, what a amazing 180-degree turn. Now the Democrats are the ones who portray anti-racism and support the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Republicans seems to be on the other side of the coin. I mean, in writing this book, you have made some parallels with everyday life today. What are some parallels that you see between this time period and slavery and racism to the present day?
Well, I think there are a number of possible comparisons you could make. I mean, one obvious one is the constantly troubled relationship between the Black community of New York and the police of New York. Not something that is of modern origin. In fact, it stretches back decades and decades. And that is, to a great extent, also what this book is about. The fact that New York police officers are terrorizing Black communities here in New York City before the Civil War. And so this distrust between the two groups, a generally white police force and Black communities, is longstanding and seemingly intractable. So that's a big, obvious comparison that can be drawn. It's also, in some ways clear that in this period of American history, before the Civil War, the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the city is really, and by that I mean the political authorities, the legal authorities, the people in power, the white people who control the economy and the politics and the government, they are not only indifferent to Black lives, but they're actively complicit in jeopardizing the basic fundamental freedoms that Black people are supposed to be enjoying here. I mean, including, the right to due process, the fact that they're arrested on trumped up charges and they're not really given their ability to articulate why they, should be seen as a free person as opposed to a runaway. So, yeah, I mean, the institutional racism, which is a word I think that we use today without really understanding the depth and the complexity of it, is really borne out here in this period of American history. The built-in biases, prejudices, violations against basic Black human rights that occur because of the indifference and often the complicity of our most powerful systems are really another obvious comparison.
Wow. Okay, my last question, from your vantage point of knowing history and knowing the present, what could be some suggestions to improve our racial differences and improve our relations with between black and white?
Well, one place to start would be knowing your history. And unfortunately, far too often Americans don't know their history. And particularly, I'm talking about white Americans. And those in particular who deny the brutality of slavery or try to gloss it over by saying, oh, it wasn't that bad, or by saying, you know, at least they were fed and taken care of, or any of the other, you know, tired tropes that are not only lies, but dangerous for our current environment. Those are all falsehoods that we as historians are trying to combat. One of the things you asked me early on was sort of my quote unquote progress or trajectory as a writer. Well, you know, a lot of the book, well, all of the books that I've written so far have been kind of this, you know, it was a little bit more esoteric, to be honest, you know, sort of more directed at academic historians. But I really wanted to write a book that would be more widely read and more, you know, sort of informative to the public about the depth of the violation of Black civil rights. So that's why at the end of the book, I note that I think you can't come away with this without thinking there is some kind of reparations that is not only completely warranted, but is morally imperative. And it's just a basic question of fairness. And for your listeners, Ta-Nehisi Coates has an amazing article called On Reparations, which was published in The Atlantic a few years ago, which is pretty famous. But that'd be a great starting point if people were interested in, you know, why it is that many of us have come to the opinion after having researched and written about and studied this era, why that some form of reparations is needed. So I think for, you know, those are two obvious ways in which, you know, maybe we can start to understand our history a little bit better.
Wow. Okay, Jonathan, can you please tell us one more time the title of the book and where people can follow you?
Sure. The title of the book, it's a long one. It's called The Kidnapping Club. And we all have to have a subtitle. And the subtitle of this book is Wall Street, Slavery, and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War. And you can get it anywhere at your local bookstore and, of course, the ubiquitous Amazon. I also have a website. It's jonathandanielwells.com. And people can contact me or check out my other work on that website.